welcome to Negotiation via the New Email, sponsored by the ABA section of Dispute Resolution. Our speaker today, Noam Ebner, is an associate professor at Creighton University School of Law's Werner Institute, where he chairs the online graduate program in negotiation and dispute resolution. Noam, please proceed with the program.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm very glad you're all here. And I want to start off by saying that I know that people have many different habits with regards to email, different habits and opinions with regards to using email to negotiate, when to use it, how to use it, and so on. And that there are a lot of good ways to do it. We're going to try and capture some of those today, but I know that there's a lot of variations out there, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of those during comment time, as well as sharing some of my own experience and research. Today, as I've said, most of my negotiation practice is done via email, and this is true both for my own coaching and consulting business when I help people conduct their own email negotiations, or for my own personal or private email negotiations, which are in an academic setting, are either my own negotiations with administration or faculty about work or salary or organizational issues, or with students over academic issues that they often seem intent to negotiate with me. Most of that, perhaps 90%, perhaps more, is conducted via email. It wasn't always that way. A lot of, until about 2000, sometime between 2000 and 2005, my negotiations, just like the rest of yours, were all conducted around a table, and then at some point moved to phone. But by 2005, I noticed that the great majority of my negotiations were being conducted through email. And I know that not everyone went through that same shift at that same time. And in fact, for many of the clients that I'm currently consulting to, that shift has kind of happened to them gradually over the past 4 or 5 years, or it's happened very suddenly over the past couple of years, and that suddenly is usually the result of a sudden change in their business environment, or a sudden a new client in a far-off country suddenly turning into becoming a major client and changing the way they do business. So I don't know which side of that spectrum you fall onto, but one thing that I very rarely hear people say to me nowadays is, no, I never negotiate anything by email. And I think that that's true. I think that very few of us do that. Before we get too much into detail, I'd like to preface by saying that this isn't the first time that the ABA's section on dispute resolution is hosting a teleconference on the topic of email negotiation, and that's a good thing for more than one reason. First of all, there's been a great deal of research and writing done on the topic, particularly over the course of the past 15 years or so. And it would have been terrible if we had waited this long to start disseminating this knowledge. But as I've said, particularly over the past few years, not only has email negotiation become more common, but the degree to which people are willing to come out and say, yes, I do this and I do this all the time, that degree has also been changing. And I say this as kind of a shout out, particularly to lawyers who for a very long time were either hesitant to negotiating via email or were hesitant to acknowledge that they negotiated a lot via email. I don't mean to be overly stereotypical, but this was kind of a trend that I noticed, and it had to do with a lot of things. One of the things were security concerns, privacy concerns, good reasons. But that's another reason why this is something that its time has come once again. And third of all, and this might be the most important reason to hold this webinar now, is that email is currently in the midst of a very, very rapid evolution. And the email that was discussed at the previous webinar on this same topic, when Janice Nadler of Northwestern University, who's been doing amazing work on email negotiation, gave a talk to the section a little over 2 years ago to this same forum. She discussed some very important issues, some of which we'll discuss again today. But email, as we'll discuss, email back then was a very, very different animal than it is nowadays. And a lot of those changes have happened without us being too aware of them taking place. And when changes in communication channels take place without the people using the communication channel being aware of that, strange things happen, interesting things happen. And we're going to be discussing some of those today. And that's why the topic of the webinar today is not just negotiation via email, but it's negotiation via the new email, in an attempt to capture just exactly what this communication medium is today. So we're going to be talking about two very very specific topics today. With the first one is, what do we need to know about communication via online text-based asynchronous communication platform currently known as email? So as to do our best when we're negotiating through this channel. And the second is, what changes in this medium do we need to keep an eye out for as negotiators, as they can really affect our success in negotiating through it. So how can we recognize, how can we cope with change and technological evolution? So these are the two central themes of today's talk, and we're actually going to deal with them in reverse order. First, we're going to deal with the medium and how it's evolved. But in order to lay the groundwork for the medium and how it's evolved, let's go back to the basics. And the basics have to do with interpersonal communication theory, how it works, and why it matters for understanding how email works. So I'm going to show you a very simple model that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And this is a model that's recognizable to many of you as a very, very basic communication loop. You see we have two little people. One is in red, who will be the receiver in this conversation, and the other is in blue, who is identified as the sender in this conversation. And we see that the sender is sending a message or a signal over to the little red guy, to the receiver. Now, this model in which a message is sent, and that message is sent through a channel, and it is received on the other side by the receiver, who then decodes it. This holds true for any conversation, whether that conversation is held face-to-face, in a boardroom, over the phone, by smoke signals, or via email. The conversation goes through, it takes place through a communication channel. That communication channel includes something that's signified here as noise. There's the channel is a filter, and it both filters things out and introduces things in, and it changes what is being said and what is being received. So in communications talk, that is either called noise, or it's called communication effects, media effects. The way the media used for communication affects the communication being conveyed and decoded. So in our case, I've equipped our two figures, one with a tiny little cell phone and the other with a tiny little tablet computer, and they're both sending and receiving messages through this channel, which is an email channel, and the message is being sent and feedback is being returned. That's the little dotted red line. Now, this model, again, is probably familiar to many of you. What we need to stress before jumping into email is that, as we've said, no medium is passive. There's no such thing as what I say you hear just as I intended you to hear it, and without any change being introduced by interpretation that is a result of media effects. So no medium is passive, no communication channel is neutral. A second thing that we need to take into account is that we are so used to face-to-face communication that we use that as our baseline. And we think that face-to-face communication is a perfect communication channel, and everything else is a little floopy. Everything else gets changed. I think that our experience with face-to-face communication For all of us who deal in conflict resolution, I think that we know better than to say that, but we still fall into that trap. Face-to-face communication introduces media effects just like any other channel. So all this breaks down into, very simply, that media choice matters. So the decision of whether to hold a conversation face-to-face or to hold it through email or through any other media, is by itself an important decision that will affect how the communication plays out. We make choices about which medium to use, and with good reason, because there's something that we all know, and that is that either intuitively or consciously, we know that we respond in one way when we're told something face-to-face, that if we read it in an email, we'll respond differently. We know that there are some things that we say, well, that's best left for, a looker-in-the-eye conversation. And there are other things that we say, you know what, maybe I'd best summarize that in an email. We do a lot of this intuitively. In today's talk, we're going to try and break some of that down and figure out when might be a good idea to use either of these media or other media. These differences, they're not chance, they're not random, they're the outcome of particular characteristics of particular communication channels. And let's jump in and briefly discuss how communication theory looks at these communication channels. And communication theory introduces two ways of breaking media down. And the first thing is by asking whether this is a rich medium or a lean medium. A rich medium means that the medium is conducive to providing content and cues. In other words, it provides both the content, the actual words that are being said, but it also provides cues. Whatever you'd like to include in cues, the colors, the richness, the tone of voice, the body language, the facial expression. So the more of these cues that are included in communication, the richer the medium is considered. So smoke signals obviously are a very lean media, a very lean medium. And text-only communication, such as an SMS text message, is also a very, very lean medium. It doesn't include cues such as voice inflections, facial expressions, body language, little hesitations in our voice. On the other hand, a telephone call adds in more richness. It adds in audio. It adds in tone of voice. Video conferencing is even richer, and face-to-face communication is seen as the richest of all communication. Email, as a form of text communication, is, as you see, somewhat low here in the yellow, and it's related to as a lean medium. Another thing that communications theory looks at when discussing what type of communication media is the notion of media interactivity. And when looking at whether a medium is interactive, we ask the following questions. Is the medium synchronous or is it asynchronous? Synchronous meaning that everything happens in real time. For example, this webinar is relatively a synchronous interaction, or at least it seems to be so. In truth, because I will be responding to questions or comments later on in the webinar, this isn't truly a synchronous conversation. But since it is real-time live video, it's generally treated as something fairly synchronous. Asynchronous would be, for example, if I pre-recorded this talk and just pushed play at the time that you showed up. That would be totally asynchronous. Email has generally been treated as asynchronous communication. That affects whether communication happens in a flow or if it breaks down into chunks. An email breaks things down into chunks. I write my chunk, and you respond with your chunk. In a face-to-face conversation, communication happens in a flow. In fact, we can both be speaking at the same time, which leads us into the topic of parallel processing. In a face-to-face conversation, me and my counterpart can both be talking at the same time, and we can both be receiving at the same time. And in fact, that's what usually kind of happens. Whether because I'm saying something and my counterpart is saying, yeah, or no, that's nonsense, shut up, whatever my counterpart is saying. So we're simultaneously transmitting, interpreting, and conveying messages. Why is all this important to lay as a background? Because this is how email has been treated for the past 15 years, based on everything that we've said so far. Email has been treated as a lean media, a media that does not convey any of the richness associated with tone of voice, with body language, with facial expressions. It is an asynchronous medium, meaning that when I speak my mind in an email, I then send it over to my counterpart, who will receive it sometime later on that day, will consider his or her response, will sit down at his or her computer, write a response, and send it back to me. So email was asynchronous. Hours or days would go by between messages. And it was an asynchronous medium. And finally, as a result of all of this, there was no parallel processing. We weren't both interacting with each other at the same time, saying and receiving things at the same time. This is how email was viewed as little as 2, 3, 4 months ago, years ago, sorry. And all the research conducted on email communication assumed that this is what email was. What I'm going to suggest throughout the remainder of this webinar is that none of this is true regarding email. Email is absolutely not an asynchronous medium. It's absolutely not as lean a medium as it used to be, and it allows for parallel processing. Why is this so? So here's what we need to take into account. So the literature on email negotiation treated email as something that is monolithic, that it's a defined communication tool, that people use it in the same way. They use it sitting behind their computer screens. They're all using the same thing and calling it email. However, email has many, many variations. It has variations, and all of these variations have changed just over the past 2 or 3 years in terms of the software used for accessing email, in terms of the hardware. By hardware, I mean the actual thingy on which you read and write your email, your computer, your tablet, your laptop, your phone, all of which has changed in the past 2 or 3 years, and also in the structural, environmental, or organizational culture in which you read, write, and work through email. There have been immense changes in all of this. And just anecdotally, this talk is the outcome of a book chapter with the same title of the webinar that I wrote about half a year ago. I was asked to update a book chapter called Negotiation via Email that I had written in 2011. The book sold wonderfully. The editors decided to do a second edition. The success had nothing to do with my chapter. Can't take any credit for that. I agreed to update my chapter thinking that it would take me about a couple of hours to sit down, do a quick search, find the few new articles that have been written on this, and incorporate them into the existing chapter, and bang it out and send it over to the editors. Instead, this turned into a 3-month project, a very intensive 3-month project in which I only focused on updating email by 3 years. While there hasn't been a lot of academic research done over the course of these 3 years, the world of practice had changed immensely. And let's look at some of those changes. Now, the first set of changes has to do with what's called the software or the client upon which you see your email. When you say, oh, I'll open my email, you actually open something. That something might be Microsoft Outlook. It might be your Gmail account. It might be Yahoo Mail. And over the past 3 years, all of these software platforms have changed fundamentally, many of them many times. Just as a good example, Hotmail, which until about 5 years ago was the #1 email client, email software client in the world, has disappeared. It's gone. Things disappear that quickly in the internet age. So everybody who was using Hotmail migrated to other platforms. Other web-based services such as Yahoo and Gmail all conducted major renovations and overhauls to their platform and really to the user interface. And that means when Yahoo or Gmail change the user interface, that means that your experience accessing your email through these clients, your user experiences changes fundamentally. The way you order your email, the way you view your email, the way you address your email, they all change fundamentally. And all of these changes always will affect the way we communicate through the medium, and as a result, they affect how we negotiate through the medium. Even as we talk, just 3 days ago, Gmail, which 6 months ago, just in time to be included in the new chapter for the book, 6 months ago it announced a complete overhaul of its email system. 3 days ago it announced that it was planning yet another one. Microsoft Outlook, for those of you who use Microsoft Outlook, which I do myself, has completely changed itself in Outlook 2007, Outlook 2010, Outlook 2013, and I'm guessing that Outlook 2015 or 16 is in the works. All of these change the way we negotiate through the medium. Don't get me started, I'll say colloquially, don't get me started on hardware. When most of the research was done on email negotiation, people accessed email on their desktop computers. In fact, since as is the norm with social science research, so much of the research was conducted on psychology and business students in college. So in the mid to late 1990s, you picture these students all going to the computer farm or the computer lab at school, sitting at row after row of computers and engaging in simulations for the research project. Certainly the picture in mind was people accessing it on desktops, but that is not how most of us access our email anymore. We now access email on our laptop computer, on our tablet, and finally, and the biggest change has certainly been that we now access our email on our smartphone. And I want to focus on this point because this is where the big change has happened and is going to get even bigger. A major feature of the smartphone, as opposed to just any regular mobile phone, is its capacity for accessing web-based or software-based email while you're on the move. You don't need to be physically hooked up to a modem or even to a wireless connection. You don't need a physical or any other type of connection to a static modem. So you're out there in the world and you have your inbox on you. We all, or just about all, now have our inbox on us. There's all sorts of conflicting data on this, but in 2012 in the US, and the US is not leading the curve on this, you see 78% adult mobile users in the US owned a smartphone, and the majority of them use it for email. That means that we have undergone a huge, huge change in the way that we now read and write our emails. And just to give an example, in 2010 when I wrote the first, in 2010-2011 when I was writing the first version of the book chapter I told you about, 43% of all emails worldwide were opened on Microsoft Outlook. And now, today, only two years later, only 18% of emails are opened on Microsoft Outlook. And whereas the most common way of accessing emails nowadays is opening them on iPhones. 23% of emails worldwide are opened on iPhones. And that doesn't take into account other types of phones, Android devices, doesn't take into account tablets. So there's been a huge change, and just picture it. It means we're opening our emails in different places. You remember that picture of people sitting at their desktop, in their office or in their home office, typing on their desktop computer, or even, the unleashed version of sitting at a laptop, even in a cafe and opening your email. That doesn't exist anymore. Nowadays, we open and read and even write our emails on buses and on trains. We do it while we're watching the kids at a playground. We do it while we're pushing them on the slide. On a swing, of course, I meant. We do it during classes, as I'm sure some of my students would testify. We do it during rock concerts, we do it during movies, and we even do it, even though I know you would never admit to it, we even do it during driving. And that introduces a world of newness into the way that we negotiate through email. And to all of those who would at this point say, yes, but even if I do all those things, I would never do that when I was negotiating through email. I might do that with an email from my spouse, or with an advertisement email, or with an email with a friend, or with an email, but I would never do it for an important email. I would say, well, if you're not doing it yet, there's a good chance that you might in the future, and therefore we need to look at those changes in the eye, and figure out what those elements of accessibility, of distraction, of a different environment, different timing in how we answer emails, the new technical limitations. I mean, just think you're now reading email on a screen that allows you to see 100 words at a time instead of 500 words at a time, and so on and so forth. But the number one change that has happened is that since we're carrying our inbox in our pockets, it's hard to look at email as an asynchronous form of communication nowadays. I very often do receive an email the moment my counterpart sends it to me. I will read it 8 seconds after he or she sends it to me. So it's not asynchronous anymore. Perhaps it's kind of synchronous. That doesn't work good in academic publications, so I called it semi-synchronous. But what I really wanted to call it is kind of, sort of, sometimes synchronous and sometimes a little less so. In fact, it's no longer something that you can categorize as synchronous or asynchronous, because sometimes you use it one way and sometimes you use it another. Before we get into the ramifications of that, I just want to say one more thing, and that is that the culture, whether it's a corporate culture or a societal culture, an organizational culture of how we use email, is also changing. So here we have two examples of Avis and Volkswagen, which as companies have come straight out and said that we're shutting down our employees' use of email. Avis has announced that it's cutting out email as a form of corporate communication at all. We're not talking through email anymore. So they've shut down email. So email is no longer part of their corporate communication scheme. So there's one organizational cultural shift. Volkswagen is now stopping to forward mail to its employees' BlackBerries outside of work hours. So there's another change, and a lot of other companies have jumped in and done changes. Made changes regarding how their employees use email. Just a couple of weeks ago, I heard that a workers' union in France representing over 1 million workers included in a collective bargaining agreement included terms regarding the use of email after work hours and on weekends. It was part of the collective bargaining agreement that such use would be limited. I'm not sure what the precise final terms of that was, but now it's become such a corporate cultural issue that it's even turned into part of collective bargaining negotiations. On a lower level, there are other cultural issues that affect. It used to be that if you would sit in a boardroom at a meeting with other members of your company and you take out your BlackBerry and start answering an email, people might frown at you and think that that was out of place. Whereas today, it might be perfectly acceptable to glance at an email, spend 30 seconds banging out a short answer and sending it. But consider also, even as you think, yeah, well, that's not too bad, that's actually acceptable, that means that there's a corporate cultural nudge towards allowing or encouraging negotiators to negotiate in bites of 30, 40 seconds. Of course, when you bang out a quick email as opposed to carefully crafting an email in the quiet of your office, you're going to write a very, very different negotiating message. So all these things are in flux. And I think that the most important thing to say is that the email of today is not going to be the email of 2015, certainly not of 2017. There are a lot of different communication media out there that are trying to displace email, even as we speak. But even if they don't, and I'm guessing that they won't, I'm guessing that at least many people on this call will still be using email in 2 or 3 years. The email that you use will not be the email that we're discussing today. The best example of this, the biggest example, is just as you walk out of this webinar, figuratively speaking, as you go back to work, as you leave your office today, notice that you are now carrying your inbox. What used to be your inbox used to be the screen of your computer. This is now your inbox. And that has changed everything. Now, let's get practical. And to get practical, I'm going to speak about 8 major challenges that email negotiators face. But before I jump into those 8 major challenges, I want to give some preliminary tips just to get us used to nailing everything down into, okay, so theory says X, but what does that mean for my negotiation practice? What should I do? What should I not do? So I'm going to throw out some preliminary tips, and I'll throw out some other tips along the way as I explain some of these challenges. But I also want you to be in a very practical mindset as I go through those challenges and ask yourself, wait, so what does this mean about my practice? And hopefully you'll translate that into questions or comments at the end of this webinar. So here's some preliminary tips. Here's one simple thing. Some people will do better with it than others, and some of that is an issue of personality. One thing related to that is that people who are logical, deductive, structured type negotiators, who tend towards positions, tend towards proof, tend towards deduction, research has shown that they might be more successful in email negotiation than people who are storyteller negotiators, people who share emotions, personal stories. You know which one you are if you have to choose, am I one of the other? While some personalities will do better with it, that doesn't mean that people who are storytellers or sharers or more tend towards emotional description should not negotiate via email. I'm just saying that they need to be more intentional about how they act. And just to know that there might be some situations that they might prefer not to do this through email. They need to think twice. The second very practical tip is that the more you use email, the better a negotiator you will be. So if you are someone who does not use email much in your personal life, now is a great time to start doing that. Because if you practice using email across the board, your success as an email negotiator, research has shown, your success as an email negotiator will simply be better. So the higher your email affinity, the better your email negotiation achievements. Here's another thing that has become very true, particularly as email has become more and more synchronous. If you're sitting in that meeting, typing out 30, 40-second short emails to someone on the other side of an email line in another country, the faster you type, the better you'll do. You'll be able to get more words, more content into those short interchanges. And again, research has shown that that tends to give you an advantage in these type of exchanges. Another thing to keep in mind is that words are everything. So many of us know the older days that in conversation, in face-to-face communication, only 7% of the content that is received by the receiver has to do with the words we say, whereas the rest is all body language and tone of voice. And only 7% is the actual words themselves. Well, in email, since we don't have body language and we don't have tone of voice, everything is words. So your words make all the difference. So choose your words extra super carefully, and much more so than even the most careful speakers do in your face-to-face conversation. And that leads into the next thing, that clarity is your best friend and ambiguity, vagueness is your worst enemy. Anything you write in an ambiguous way can and will be interpreted and used against you in a court of email. It's just the way it is. We'll discuss this a little further, but that is a great reason to write important emails when you are not distracted. Write important emails when you can read through them carefully. Ask someone else to read your important negotiation emails and ask them what you said. Ask them if it is clear. This is the best way to make sure that you're getting the proper message across. And on this point, and this is a very, very, very practical tip, is none of these. Okay? I used to resist people who said don't use emoticons, because I thought emoticons are actually a helpful tool for kind of warming up the atmosphere. I'm all in favor of creating a less than formal atmosphere, a real, some sort of personal connection, adding warmth into the conversation. So I'm not saying don't use emoticons because they're unprofessional. I'm saying don't use emoticons because they are ambiguous. What you mean by one smiley face or frowny face is not necessarily what the other party will interpret. And just as my own personal favorite example of this is once when I gave a student a grade that she was very, very worried about, and the next day, and she got a pretty good grade, and the next day she wrote me this text message, and she said, "Noam, thanks for the grade, wink." And to this day, I have no idea what she meant by this wink. Was she saying, "I know I didn't deserve it, so thanks, buddy, for doing me a favor"? Was she saying just a general friendly, I don't know, wink? Was she trying to smile and wrote a wink by mistake? Is she hitting on me? I have no idea. So I stopped using emoticons, and I strongly urge that you do too. Let's zoom out just a little now and discuss 8 challenges that email negotiators face, that mainly they face them as opposed or in contrast to face-to-face negotiators. Not going to read through the list. We'll go through them one by one or through most of them depending on time. But the first one should be clear to everyone who is communicated through email, and that is that there's something about text-based communication done through email that causes people to engage in squeaky wheel behavior. It causes flare-ups, flame wars, insults, name-calling, and in general, harsher tactics, threats, ultimatums, and also, by the way, simply higher demands. People are more comfortable making higher demands through email. So this, of course, often shoots your chances for a successful negotiation in the foot. It's just something that the medium does to us, and we need to be aware of that. On the other hand, it also the medium offers positive effects, media effects on this front, one of which is reduced arousal. There's that one person whom you often negotiate with, whom you simply can't stand the sound of their voice. And no matter what they say, you're likely to say no or to think that they're working against you just because of their voice, of the annoying look on their face, and taking that those cues out of the room, taking them off the table, so to speak, removing them from the interaction, can sometimes help us focus on the important part, on the actual content of what we're discussing. Another advantage of email negotiation is that it reduces the salience of things that cause bias, such as gender or race. When you're writing an email, nobody can see the color of your skin, no one can see your gender. So even if they know what race you are, and even if they are biased towards that race, towards that gender, towards that whatever, they don't have it there in their face all the time, and therefore they're less likely to be triggered by it and lead it to whatever their own negative reactions to that trigger is. So, to put this into practice, here are some good reasons to prefer email as a negotiating medium. If you know that you often rub the other the wrong way, or if the other rubs you the wrong way, email can be a pretty advantageous medium to work through. If you think that you might be disadvantaged owing to the other's bias, if you think they have a bias towards your race, towards your gender, towards any other external characteristic, unless you want to make a point of that, you might consider removing that characteristic simply by removing presence and by reverting to text. And third, and this is important for many negotiators, is if you aspire to ask for something that you're not really sure you'll be able to pull off asking for in a face-to-face setting, if you want to ask for an exorbitant sum of money, which you think that you wouldn't be able to even put on the table if you were looking the other in the eye, well, you'll be able to do that through an email, so maybe you should prefer email. Another thing to remember in practice is when you find yourself getting into a fight with someone over email, just remember that's what the internet does. That's a primary media effect of online communication via text. Even just reminding yourself of that can save you a lot of grief. The second is to remember to separate the people from the problem. Email negotiation combines the people with the problem all the time. That's what happens. That's what the medium does. So if you've remembered this as a mantra in previous negotiation training, it is certainly something to repeat to yourself even more often when you're negotiating through email. And finally, in general, research has shown that the more you can unmask yourself in the sense of reminding the other that there is a human being on the other side of the line, that they're dealing with a person and not with a computer screen, that they're dealing with a human being and not with an inbox. The more you can do that, the more likely that these media effects of heightened contentiousness and increased flaming and fighting will go away. So the more you can remind the other that you're a person, and you can do that simply by dropping references into the email conversation that reminds that there's a person. Even just speaking about the weather in your part of the world will remind that you're a flesh and blood person. Saying I spent time with the kids will remind them that you are a flesh and blood person, someone who they can and should empathize with, treat with decency, treat with respect, not go out of their way to step on, and so on and so forth. Okay, so those are very, very practical ways of dealing with this media effect. A second, which is directly connected to the first, is that there seems to be less inter-party process cooperation through email as opposed to face-to-face, and this results in less information being shared. Parties don't tell each other as much. And since parties don't tell each other as much, and since we're not as good as interpreting things through email, we have reduced accuracy in judging what the other party's interests really are. Now, take less information and less accuracy in understanding interests and combine that with a tendency of email towards increased self-interested behavior. We're focused on ourselves. Add into that a general tendency towards increased competitive behavior. And what you have is a recipe for less cooperation in the process. Forget the outcome. We're simply looking at ourselves, at our own interests. We're putting our own positions forward. We only care about that. We're not too interested in what the other party has to say to us. And even when we are trying to read the other party, we're not getting such a good read on the other party. And perhaps at some point, we give up on doing that. These are all tendencies of people during email negotiation. On the other hand, email can also, in certain ways, can also increase information exchange. And the main reason for this is that people participate differently in email communication when compared with people in a room. This is particularly true for large group conversations, or even small group conversations, but anything larger than a dyad. So if you have an email negotiation in which 4 people are involved, things are going to be different than having the 4 of you together in a room. For example, there are people who tend to participate less in face-to-face conversations. Just to throw out the 2 main points, women and minorities participate less in face-to-face group conversations, and they generally don't participate first. Whereas in email conversations, they participate just as much, and they participate first equally as much as anybody else, which means that different voices are heard, different valuable information gets in there. People who might get disregarded or just not get a chance to speak do get a chance to speak, and that can be a huge advantage both for those particular parties, but also for everybody involved in the negotiation. In an email conversation, it's much harder for one party to take control of the conversation, as I'm sure many of you are very skilled at doing in a face-to-face conversation. In practice, let's give some advice for working with some of these issues. So one is remembering that there's less process cooperation. One thing to do is to intentionally use process cooperative language. Use the word cooperation. Use the word sharing. Use the word I want to know what your interests are. Let me share my interests so that you understand them well. And if you don't understand anything, just ask me and I'll respond to you. By using this language clearly and overtly, you have a chance at breaking through the fog that causes less process cooperation. Another thing is take advantage of email to take the stage. Nobody can shout you down. No one can give you that look that shuts you up. So change your own conversational dynamic. Remember, I can speak my mind in this negotiation. Craft that long, carefully thought out email and give the speech, not so much a speech, but deliver the message that perhaps you would not deliver in a face-to-face conversation. You have the opportunity to do so. Use it. A third thing, ask lots of questions. We'll give another reason for doing this later, but asking questions is a great way to encourage process cooperation. Use that tool. And finally, I found that negotiating on a smartphone is in itself somewhat prohibitive to fostering this process cooperation, because I can't write out those long, thoughtful, cooperative messages in which I explain myself precisely and at length, making sure the other party understands and inviting them to explain themselves to me. I can't do that on a small screen with tiny buttons. Instead, I write 30, 40-word emails and send them off. This leads us into a new thing that we didn't have 2 years ago. You can choose and should choose the machine on which you participate in of any particular negotiation at any particular point, there are some things you don't want to answer from your smartphone. Take note. Another challenge to email negotiators comes directly out of the previous one. There's a reduction in process cooperation, so there's a reduction in integrative outcomes. The research isn't uniform on this, but it seems that there is probably a lower degree of integrative outcomes. There's a higher rate of impasse in email negotiation. The mechanisms for this are unclear. It might be related to process cooperation, to low process cooperation. It might be related to other things. And indeed, there are some experiments that have resulted in absolutely no differences. But I would suggest, I would quickly suggest that that if you are facing a negotiation which an integrative outcome is absolutely crucial, think twice about email. It's not crucial in every negotiation, but if you know ahead of time that it's crucial, think twice. And if you do it by email, then add in another channel. Remember that the smartphone that you're using for email can also be used to pick up the phone. Yeah, it's actually a phone. Add in another communication channel to augment, to support whatever cooperation you're trying to foster. And hoping to bring to a cooperative outcome. And in general, simply pay close attention to the previous two issues of cooperation and contentiousness, and be very, very mindful of your messages. Fourth, I think I hardly need to share that this is a huge challenge in email negotiation. You have no idea who your opposite is showing your messages to. You have no idea where your email is going to wind up. Your letters they're recorded, they're archived, they can even be changed. You have no idea what is going to happen to them in the end, or where you might run into them. And that's even if everything goes well. That's just talking about if your counterpart does something nasty. But remember that you can also write an email and then click reply all instead of reply, and send it out to the world in a very inappropriate manner. Everybody on this call has probably done that, and I hope didn't pay too bad a price for it. And that's a huge problem of this privacy issue. On the advantages side, this also means that we can take advantage of email to consult in real time on our negotiation processes in a way that we could never do in a face-to-face negotiation. We can forward an email to someone and ask them, what do you think? How do you think I should respond? We can share our screen with someone and show them our screen. We can take out our smartphone and show it to our boss or show it to our partner and say, this is what I got. What would you suggest responding? And we can also archive every email we ever receive for future use. Some people erase emails. I keep it all. You never know. I keep everything. Maybe that's just me, but I'm not a hoarder in real life. In practice, here are some things to watch for. The address field. Make sure that the address field is the first thing you read before you write your own email. You want to make sure that you're sending it to the right person. You want to make sure that you're replying and not reply-alling. I would suggest leaving the address field blank until you're ready to send the email, at which point you type in the address of the right person. So even if you've clicked reply, erase the address field. Take everybody out of it. And that's a good way to make sure that you won't send it by mistake to the right person, but in the middle. Again, in practice, record all your emails. Use your stored messages in later interactions with your counterpart. You can say, as you said to me 3 weeks ago, and then you copy-paste it into the email. And finally, and I can't stress this enough, never ever write anything in the email that you wouldn't want your kids to see appearing in your name later on in the news. The next challenge is that online, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the topic of interpersonal trust is a huge challenge. Our decisions on how to trust people, should we trust people, and even more important, how can we make other people trust us as negotiators, it gets much trickier online. and particularly email is a very, very difficult medium for which to induce trust in our counterparts. And here I'm going to recommend, let me say that in general, anybody interested in reading the chapter that this talk is somewhat based on, you can find it its full text on the internet just by typing in if you type in Noam Ebner email, you'll reach it. If you type in Noam Ebner SSRN, you'll be to Google. You'll be sent to my SSRN page where I have a bunch of articles uploaded that you can download them there. And in addition to the main article that this chapter is based on, you'll find another article there on trust building and e-negotiation. The way I got interested in this whole topic of email negotiation was through the prism of trust. How do we make people trust us at a distance? So I wrote a couple of papers on it that you can read there, but just let's look at some of the challenges. Even just the question of people lying, which is like the biggie in terms of trust or no trust. Research has shown that people might lie more often through email than they do face to face, and that makes perfect sense. Not everybody's a good liar in terms of looking you in the eye and lying, but it's easier to lie at a distance using words, and you don't have to pull it off being opposite someone in a room. Another issue is that people suspect each other of lying more often online, even when they're not actually lying. So if in face-to-face situations, I think that 50% people, I think someone is lying 50% of the time, I'm likely to think that about 70% of the people when we're negotiating online. If I mix that up, then I'm going to repeat that. If I suspect 50% of the people face-to-face, I might suspect 70% of the people online, when in fact it could be that the numbers are no different, or that I'm not any more accurate online than I was offline. In fact, in general, people are very unskilled at identifying liars, and you can see the numbers here on your screen. And we're especially unskilled at identifying liars when we're identifying them online. So how do we make people trust us in this trustless environment? So we can look at the advantages. One is that the slowed down pace allows us to be very conscious and intentional about our trust building moves. So we can avoid trust infractions, and we can do more trust building moves. And here are just a couple. One is that no matter what kind of negotiator you are, it has been shown that building rapport, that kind of building that ad hoc instant relationship with your counterpart, is just important online as it is face-to-face. Don't skip it just because you're doing this by email. That social lubrication, kind of light, off-topic conversation about, what about them Knicks and how's the weather by you, is just as valuable when negotiating through email as it is when negotiating face-to-face. And that's the title of a famous article. It's famous because it's a good article, and it's also famous because it came up with a catchy title, Schmooze or Lose. And in this research article, the researchers demonstrated that negotiators who took the time in their email conversations to include light social conversation in addition to exchanging messages on topic did better than negotiators who did not. Another piece of advice that we sometimes forget about is that when you can, mix media. Too often when we start a negotiation through email, we stick to email just because that's where we are. You can always pick up the phone, and introducing just a little bit of a richer media might help towards building trust. And finally, those of you who have studied negotiation surely remember that when speaking about trust, one of the things discussed while speaking about trust is the topic of empathy, and how by listening and reflecting and paraphrasing and our body language and nodding and acknowledging what the other party is saying, we're building a trusting environment. And yet most of us, when we write through emails, we leave all that aside. And I'd like to suggest that that is not something you cannot leave aside. You just have to figure out how to do it online. So you have to figure out how to show empathy. And that includes reflecting the other's messaging. It includes active listening in a way that seems strange to do in emails, but yeah, you can repeat what the other party said. You can even cut and paste it and paraphrase it a bit. Show that you were listening. Show that you're attentive. That will be a trust-building move. Okay? As time is getting short, I want to jump forward to one thing that is very important in email negotiation, particularly nowadays as we're working through mobile devices, and that is just that we now negotiate when we are much less focused than we used to be. Parties suffer from confusion, from low cognitive retention of previous messages, from diminished concentration. The reason they do this is because they're negotiating on a bus. The reason they do this is because we're negotiating while we're in the supermarket, and in all sorts of other places where the email on our smartphone happened to catch us. And by the way, even if we don't do this, our counterpart may be. And very often, we need our counterpart to be unconfused. We need our counterpart to be all there and concentrated. So while many of us think that, yeah, but it's not so bad because I'm a good multitasker, I can choose my cornflakes and compare prices at the same time as I can type out a good negotiation response. The fact is that research is now coming out showing that nobody's a good multitasker. That while people who are relatively fast multitaskers, they're able to switch quickly between taking care of their kids and typing a negotiation response, part of their brain is always working on the task they're not busy with right now. So even though we might be good at multitasking, we're actually less good at each individual task. And research is being done on that now. We haven't seen the last word on that. And finally, in general, my advice, at least at present, is think twice before negotiating from your smartphone. Simply because we tend to do it in noisy, crowded, busy environments where there are other things in our mind, things that can distract us. And that's in addition to screen limitations, typing limitations, and so on. There's no good. The bottom line is that there's no good solution to this. In practice, just stay focused. But even just remembering that this is what negotiation over the internet does to us might keep you from making some of those mistakes. Now, with just 4 or 5 minutes left, I want to check in once again just to see if there are any questions or comments at this point, or whether I'll jump into some final suggestions.
I just have one question that just came up now.
Yeah.
And they're asking how rich a form of communication is video conferencing? Do you know why it is not used as often as telephone for negotiation, given how easy it is today?
That is a fantastic question, and not in the way that speakers always say about all questions, that's a fantastic question, but in the sense that, like so many others, we've been waiting for video phone for the past 30 years. People have been saying it's right around the corner, and when it comes, we're all going to use it. And then what happened is that it came, and nobody has used it. Very few people use it to the degree that people expected that we would. One thing is that you can look up the history of the video conference, the video talk, the video phone on the internet, and you'll find that it has been around for nearly 100 years. They've been trying to implement it as a technology. It's been around for 40 years, and it has not been used. It has been used even less specifically for negotiation. And I want to say 2 things on that. One is that I think that it will be used more and more from negotiation, and I'm seeing this in my own practice simply because people are starting to get used to using it to speak with their children in another state or with their grandchildren in another country. So they're starting to realize, yeah, this is not as scary a technology as we thought it would. We're seeing that shift in online dispute resolution, that more and more mediators are shifting from offering text-based services to offering video-based services, and sometimes that's as simple as offering Skype-based services. So we're seeing this shift happening. I'm seeing it happening with my clients for negotiation, but I agree that it is slow and not nearly to the extent that we expected to see it. And the second part of the answer is that many people think that video conferencing will simply provide all of the media richness that face-to-face provides, and therefore all the media effects that we associate with text-based communication will just disappear. And I think that the commenter who suggested that it would have its own degree of media richness and it would have its own set of media effects is absolutely correct. And on that SSRN site, I put up a paper that I recently wrote with a former student of mine, Jeff Thompson, who's an expert on nonverbal communication, and we did some work on video-based mediation and nonverbal communication. And one of the things we suggested, the main theme that we suggested, is that as you reintroduce media richness back into negotiation and mediation processes by means of going to video, you're going to encounter a whole new set of media effects that you weren't expecting. It's not going to be the same as face-to-face conversation. Your body language is different. The amount of your counterpart that you see on the screen is different. Eye contact is different. There are a lot of things that are different, and assuming that it's going to be the same just because it's video is the wrong place to start. So I'd like to call attention to that and to suggest, again, Noam Ebner, SSRN, or Noam Ebner, Face Value is the name of that article. You'll see more of that. Any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay. I think our time has now run out. Is that correct?
Yes. Did you have any closing comments though before I do close out?
Well, then let me share one in a 1 minute set of practice tips. Okay. The more significant a negotiation is to you, the more you should, A, avoid a smartphone, as I've said. B, don't forget that you can always pick up the phone. You can always pick up the phone and call, and you can always get someone's opinion before sending one of those really, really important messages. What I tell my clients is if they remember these three things, stay off your smartphone as much as you can. If you are on your smartphone, always ask yourself, well, what about if I just call the guy? And third, whenever you have an important message, ask someone, whether it's me who's consulting to them or just the guy sitting next to you. Just these three rules of thumb will save you a world of grief. And finally, in conversation, there are four things you can keep in mind, and I'm just banging them out so that people this Prezi is available online. I can share that later with anybody who wants it, so you can find it. But I'll just say there are ways to communicate more successfully via email, and one good way is whatever you say, wrap it up with a bottom line summary sentence, so that if you have not been clear at some point in your email, you can always say, well, the summary of all this is X, Y, Z. Such as I'll say now, the summary of everything I said now is do your best to be absolutely clear when communicating by email. One way to avoid being unclear is to ask lots of questions. Another way to avoid unclarity is to always ask your counterpart to relate to parts of the email that they forgot to relate to. You know that counterpart who you asked 4 questions and they answered 3? Ask them to answer the 4th. And finally, my suggestion, avoid emoticons. I'm going to end here with a little smiley face on my face. but I'm not going to use that in an email negotiation. And I'd like to be mindful and respectful of everyone's time and wrap it up here.